Good afternoon. So today we're going to talk about psychology and its connection with our brain and body. So we're going to talk about the genes that we receive at the point of conception, how our nervous system, which the brain is a part of our nervous system, and how that's going to affect our experience. Last week we briefly talked about evolution and how it relates to the concept of functionalism. So this week we're going to talk about how does evolution relate to psychology. So the basic idea here is that whatever is useful is maintained and whatever is not useful is not maintained. So if that trait is useful, then that trait will remain in the evolution of the animal or the species or the person. So for example, sickle cell anemia is more often found in places like sub-Saharan Africa where malaria is common. Because if you carry the trait for sickle cell, even if you don't show symptoms of sickle cell, then you are resistant to the development of malaria. Okay, so in that way, it's adaptive for its particular environment. Some other basic words you may use in this class are genotype versus phenotype. So genotype is the actual genes that you have, whereas phenotype is how those genes appear. So you could carry certain genes but never see them, for example. The basic idea I want you to gather from this section is that we inherit certain genes or genetic predispositions from our family. However, your environment is going to determine whether or not those genes actually present themselves. So while schizophrenia may run in your family, and you may even have an identical twin with schizophrenia, if you don't have a life situation, like an accident or something terrible, you may never develop it. Not only do our genes determine who we are, but our early environment and even our environment throughout our life. Conversely, that environment also determines our genes, hence sickle cell. So this next section reviews our nervous system. So one of the key terms that you need to understand by the end of this section is what is a neuron. A neuron is a type of cell that is necessary in our nervous system that allows our brain to function. So those dendrites is where new information is received, and the terminal buttons is where information is sent out. That myelin sheath is basically fatty tissue that allows the messages to be transferred much faster or quick. You can think of it like a wire and the myelin sheath like the insulation for the wire. Now remember those terminal buttons that send out messengers? The way that they do that is through something called neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are essentially chemical messengers that jump the synaptic gap. So if you have a terminal button and a dendrite, there's a little space between them, and those neurotransmitters jump the gap, and that's how two neurons communicate. That was a brief summary. Make sure to review your textbook to understand how a neuron functions in the nervous system. So let's briefly touch on the neurotransmitters and their relationship to drugs. So when a neuron releases neurotransmitters and those neurotransmitters jump that synaptic gap or that synaptic cleft to the other neurotransmitter to communicate the message, whatever neurotransmitter is left over, so let's say serotonin, whatever is left after that message is communicated, then it is sucked back up in this process called reuptake. Okay? Now, some drugs stop or interfere with this process of reuptake. One very common drug that interferes with this process is called SSRIs. So, selective serotonin reuptake. So as I was saying, SSRIs are essentially drugs that stop the reuptake of serotonin. And so when you stop that reuptake process, you have more serotonin floating around. All right. And that is one of the ways that the drugs work to alleviate symptoms of anxiety and depression. There are several other neurotransmitters and drugs that mimic those different neurotransmitters. So I want you to review the list of those neurotransmitters in your PowerPoint in your textbook. So in your nervous system, you have two different parts. So we're going to talk about the central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, So the peripheral nervous system is broken down into somatic and autonomic nervous system. So your somatic nervous system is responsible for voluntary movement, and then your autonomic nervous system is responsible for things that you're not consciously aware of, like the way that your stomach operates. Now further, within that autonomic nervous system, we have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is like your fight or flight response. This is going to prepare your body for action. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system is going to bring your body back down and is responsible for keeping your body at the steady state in which it is typically in. So back to the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, you can see right here we have the corpus callosum, or the split right in the middle. Okay, and we have the two hemispheres of your brain, and we're also looking at the cerebral cortex, or the part of your brain that looks like kind of squiggly. So these photos are pulled directly from your textbook, and they break down each lobe and what their predominant functions are. So that frontal lobe, which is right here near your forehead, this is going to be responsible for future thinking and reason, motor control, like conscious motor control. It also contains, because we just said it contains language, it contains bronchius area, which is essential for you to be able to produce language. Where you process language or hear, understand is located in a different part of your brain. So I want you to review these different parts of your brain in your textbook using these pages that I've indicated here. And then I also have an assignment that I want you to complete and then submit for credit that basically asks you to look at those different parts of your brain and identify them and their different functions. I'm going to highlight a few that we're going to go over and over again in the class. One of those was that very prefrontal cortex area and the frontal lobe area in general. The next word that we're going to hear a lot in this class is the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is where explicit memories are stored or basically processed. It's sort of like a save button, and it helps you to process memories over time. And so the destruction of the hippocampus doesn't necessarily deteriorate much older memories, but it does deteriorate your ability to store memories over time. Another part of the brain that I want to particularly highlight is the amygdala. So this is going to be where you process emotions like fear and anger, and those also where you store like unconscious memories about fear and anger, so like maybe associations you learned in childhood. This is the last one that I want to particularly highlight, is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is where you're going to store memories on how to do things. So these are like how to ride a bicycle, how to like do physical things with your. Now, all of these different brain areas are important for the course. This is why I want you to go over them all. And I also want you to do this assignment that's going to ask you to kind of organize them, but I want to highlight those in particular. Okay, so this whole time we've been talking about neurotransmitters and how they operate within the brain and how they act very quickly. They jump that gap, that synaptic gap between two neurons, right? So something that's similar to neurotransmitters, but take a longer time to work or function in your body, but have a longer / lingering effect, are hormones. Okay, so you want to think about the juxtaposition between neurons or neurotransmitters and hormones.